For the first day of the war, the regiment's mission was to kick the Vietnamese People's Army out of this battle space, a bunch of hilltops, within easy rifle shot of each other, like an evil game board, where most squares on the board can be hit with rifle fire from several other places on the board. Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of China's army. I'm Jason Clower, and today I'm going to take you deep into the tall grass of northern Vietnam. See, when China invaded Vietnam in 1979, they planned to revisit one of the first and worst battlefields of the Indochina War. That was the war that the Chinese and Vietnamese communists fought together against France in the early 1950s. That battlefield was a stretch of territory that once upon a time was called Route Coloniale 4, or now just Highway 4. You may remember that from a previous episode. Back then, China had helped Ho Chi Minh's Revolutionary Army to demonstrate how easy it was to invade Highway 4 from Chinese territory, because that highway ran practically right alongside the Chinese border. And back in the war, the communists showed that if you owned Highway 4, you could then make a heck of a ruckus in northeastern Vietnam for whomever was governing from Hanoi. Fast forward to 1979, and now China wanted to give the Vietnamese government a spanking. Their words, not mine. And they figured, okay, back in the 50s, we helped the Vietnamese communists do that to the French on Highway 4. Now we're going to do it to them. At the bottom of Highway 4 is Long Son, which is the main border crossing with China through what they called the Friendship Gate. And since nothing says friendship like an armored spearhead, the PLA decided to invade Long Son. That probably should have been pretty easy, because Long Son is so close to the Chinese border that it looks like if you stood inside Chinese territory with a lacrosse stick and a pretty good arm, you ought to be able to break windows in Long Son. Now, that's an exaggeration, but if you have 10 divisions to help you, it should be easy. However, for the PLA, it was not. And at the top end of Highway 4, where our story is today, the job was harder. Up there, Highway 4 is anchored by Cao Bang. It's not a huge city. It's about the size of Chico, my beloved rural college town in the far north of California, where we have more almond trees than people. But Cao Bang is located on some nasty topography that makes it one of those graveyards of empires. It's surrounded by complexly corrugated valleys full of shoulder-high grasses. It's hot, humid, steep, overgrown, and the ground undulates under your feet so weirdly that if you're a commander up on a hilltop, you can actually lose sight of your own platoons because they can be swallowed up by the tall grass. The PLA was to discover there that sometimes a battalion officer would look at a subunit's last known position and now have no idea whether his guys over there were all dead or whether they'd just been swallowed up in the microterrain. China had plenty of experience in that region because during the Vietnam War against the French and the Americans, China used to move tons of aid to Vietnam through there. But now that China was trying to visit Cao Bang without an invitation, there was no good way to walk there from China. The least bad way was to pick up the road from this place called Taling. I'm unapologetically sinicizing the pronunciation because I don't speak Vietnamese. Taling was just a few kilometers inside Vietnamese territory. And once you got there, I mean, good luck getting to Cao Bang in one piece, but at least you'd have a road that you could drive on. That was the idea. And that was the pretty crappy mission that the PLA gave to the best regiment they had available. That regiment was the 368th Regiment of the 123rd Division. And that division went all the way back to the Civil War. And in fact, they're still around today, and they're still a big deal. In the mid-80s, they became the 123rd Motor Rifle Division. And then later they became the 123rd Mechanized Division. And just a few years ago, there was another reorg, and they became the 123rd Combined Arms Brigade. And their hard metal core was, and still is, the 368th Regiment. Before the invasion, as Beijing was making its war plan, They earmarked 9 corps to invade Vietnam. In theory, a PLA corps comprised 3 divisions of about 10,000 men each. And actually, I'm going to pause here and make you eat your educational vegetables with a quick refresher on basic PLA math. If you're a fan of this channel, then A, you are so cool. And B, you know that in theory, the classical PLA was organized in triangles. 3 men to a small group, which is what we'd call a fire team, 3 small groups to a squad, then so on up through platoon, company, battalion, regiment, division, and corps. These were numbered consecutively. So, for example, in 1 corps, you had the PLA's 1st, 2nd, and 3rd divisions. In 2 corps, it was the 4th, 5th, and 6th divisions, and so on. Going back to the 1st division, its infantry were the PLA 1st, 2nd, and 3rd regiments. The 2nd division was home to the PLA's 4th, 5th, and 6th regiments, and so on. If you're dorky enough to fiddle around on a whiteboard and practice this PLA arithmetic, then 1, I really like you. And 2, you'll see now that you can figure out every regiment in the classic PLA, its higher headquarters, and its sister units. And at the end of the video, I'll actually put in a problem set that you can do as homework if you want. Friends, on reflection, I'm going to make that problem set into a separate video because this one is already running so long. That way we can take our time and have fun with it. So now you can see that when the storied 123rd Division went to war in Vietnam, they went with 41 Corps. And they comprised the 367th, 368th, and 369th regiments. The 368th Regiment was a great regiment, all right, with a heck of a history. However, in 1979, they were green. As we've mentioned in a previous episode on logistics, as the PLA prepared for this invasion in 1979, they poured new recruits into these divisions to fill them out. These were green recruits, mostly inducted in the previous month or two. So in the few weeks before Invasion Day, the PLA trained up these newbies as fast as they could. Each recruit went to the firing range 2 whole times. I would guess that each one fired a maximum of 20 rounds from a rifle total, and he threw 3 to 5 practice grenades. As we also mentioned in that logistics episode, China didn't just lack trained men, they were also plagued with old, dud ammo that was so degraded that 1/3 of it would not go bang. So remember that, friends, because that's going to be very important to today's story. Raw recruits, rotten ammo. For the first day of the war, February 17th, 1979, the regiment's mission was to kick the Vietnamese People's Army, the VPA, out of this battle space, about 2 kilometers on a side. It was dotted with hilltops that were spaced about 150 to 250 meters apart from each other. So that fact, a bunch of hilltops within easy rifle shot of each other, made this area like an evil game board where most squares on the board can be hit with rifle fire from several other places on the board. And on top of that, every high point could hold a heavy weapon that was dug in and surrounded by wire and punji sticks and minefields, and of course, that difficult, vegetated, ankle-breaking terrain. Also on the minus side of the Chinese ledger were their enemies, the Vietnamese People's Army, because they knew that something was coming. How did the Vietnamese know that? Well, one was they could read a map. They had heard the Chinese doing artillery practice for over a month. They knew that the Chinese were up to something. And they had to know that the Chinese would want to attack Cao Bang. And since there weren't many avenues from which to do that, the Vietnamese kind of knew there must be something behind door number 1. But also, the PLA invasion force did kind of tip their hand and tell the VPA when they were coming, if the VPA didn't already know. See, a few miles from this crossing, the 123rd's sister division, the 122nd, was waiting behind door number 2. They had been saddled with an especially difficult assignment, which was to capture another, even less appealing road to Cao Bang. And they assigned 2 regiments to attack on a broad front, while they would send a small flanking force of 1 infantry and 1 tank company to race around on an end run behind the Vietnamese. That was the idea. However, the day before the planned launch of the big offensive, somebody screwed up in the 122nd Division, the sister division. Their units were also full of raw green recruits, and somebody in an engineering unit over there was preparing satchel charges when he accidentally detonated 5 of these things together, which wiped out half his platoon. I mean, what rotten luck. In an army full of dud munitions, you get 5 satchel charges that all work, and then you accidentally blow them up in half a platoon. Ugh. Well, at regimental headquarters, they heard this unholy explosion, which was so loud that they mistook it for Vietnamese shelling. And they concluded that the VPA had gotten wise to their invasion plan, and that now they were being shelled from the Vietnamese side of the border as a preemptive attack on the Chinese preparation. And so that regimental HQ decided, okay, that's it, we go now. And they ordered everyone in their regiment to equip himself and prepare to attack at once. After a while, somebody on the command staff learned that there had been this accidental own goal involving satchel charges, and they sorted out the confusion. However, just in case the Vietnamese on the other side of the wire had not figured out that they were about to be invaded, the 122nd Division had just given them a further clue. In spite of this cock up, at go time on the 17th of February, things started all right. At midnight, they sent their recon ninjas crawling out into no man's land to do dagger and silencer stuff to the Vietnamese sentries out there. And then at dawn, the plentiful Chinese artillery fired 20 minutes of preparatory fire. Now, to me, that sounds kind of skimpy for an artillery corps that was formed on the Soviet model. But then again, remember that these are the guys whose munitions are so old that 1/3 of them had decayed into duds. So, one way or another, they shot 20 minutes of preparatory fire, which they considered quite substantial. And then at 7 a.m. promptly, the whistle blew for the infantry to attack. Over in the 368th Regiment's area, the infantry did well. They demolished obstacles, they cleared lanes for the assault force to pass through the wire and the minefields and the punji sticks toward their assigned hilltop objectives. However, over in their sister division, the hapless 122nd, their counterparts, who had failed to blow themselves up the day before, now won their unit's second Darwin Award. Over there, another demolition platoon was clearing obstacles and mines. A new recruit got nervous, and he accidentally blew up 5 of his buddies. Well, that wasn't as bad as the previous day when they wiped out half a platoon, so maybe they were learning, right? Well, see, there was more. When that man blew himself up with 5 of his friends, he also startled some surrounding soldiers who now dove for cover. It turns out that 19 of those soldiers dove straight onto Vietnamese mines that they were supposed to be clearing. So they blew themselves up too. And that still wasn't the end. When the artillery finished firing and the infantry moved into the attack, the lane that they were moving through now had not been completely demined. And 8 more guys got blown up. So that's a platoon and a half of self-blow-uppage. The 122nd Division literally decimated a battalion of themselves before the VPA could even get their binoculars focused. Now, YouTube is going to hate me for saying this, but the 122nd Division probably needed a hotline for people like this. Like, are you a PLA soldier who's going to blow himself up? We can help. Reach for the phone, not the satchel charge. Well, back in the 368th Regiment, I guess 2nd Battalion had decided that they would save their killing for the enemy, and they were doing pretty well at it. 2nd Battalion sent their 4th Company. Again, you can follow the math here. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Company would belong to 1st Battalion. 4th, 5th, and 6th mathematically belonged to 2nd Battalion. See how easy this is? 2nd Battalion sent 4th Company to a place called Hill 303. This was one of the 3 key positions for the VPA, and they had planned this complicated assault ballet where 2 of their platoons would attack from 2 sides to hold the enemy's attention, while their 3rd platoon would stay hidden and then wait opportunistically to sneak in and attack when the Vietnamese defenders were suitably distracted. Friends, what is this tactic called? That's right, it's 1.2 faces. Classic PLA tactic, and it worked. That sneaky platoon did eventually get spotted by a neighboring Vietnamese position on Hill 14, and they did get walloped and lose their platoon leader. However, one of their squad leaders stepped into his place and finished the attack. So now that they had taken Hill 303, 4th Company was still on a roll, and so they kept going and attacked Hill 13, because that was the centerpiece to a bunch of the other peaks. And if they got it, they could pluck a bunch of other hills, 302, 12, 14, all of them key sites of the Vietnamese defenders' heavy weapons. So with that one stroke, they would then have most of the regiment's objectives for the day done. So with this prize dangling in front of them, 4th Company poured into the Vietnamese communication trenches to see if they could just run right through these things and pop up unexpectedly in the heart of the Vietnamese position. However, the Vietnamese defenders were ready for them, and they trained a bunch of heavy weapons down on the Chinese and stopped 5 attacks in a row. Then they launched their own counterattacks, which the Chinese in turn fought off. So that left the 2 sides stalemated and the Chinese with a lot of casualties. They didn't know it, but the VPA had hustled in a class full of their best officer candidates to reinforce and lead the defensive works that the regiment was attacking that morning. Those cadets knew what they were doing, and in fact, one of them was the future Vietnamese defense minister. Well, while this was going on, and 4th Company had the crown jewels almost tantalizingly in their grasp, their sister company, the 5th Company, got back in the action. They had started the day as the Pathfinders. Well, they cleared the obstacles for the assault force. Now, they were going to go for another of the Vietnamese crown jewels, a big, tall thing called Hill 815. Remember, friends, the reason that the Chinese were in this neighborhood to begin with was that it held the road south to Cao Bang, and they wanted to travel that road without getting shot at from these many surrounding hills. Well, the king of those hills was Hill 815. Anybody who held that could shoot at the road, they could shoot at the other hilltops, and if the PLA got that hill, they would control this crossroads. They could shoot at the other main Vietnamese positions here. They could prevent Vietnamese reinforcements from arriving by either of these roads, and they could prevent any retreating Vietnamese from escaping down these roads. That was 5th Company's job, and they definitely ate their Wheaties that morning. Because first, they sent one platoon to do this very complicated, daring thing where they scaled a neighboring peak from 3 sides under fire, and then they mounted a heavy machine gun up there so that they could rain supporting fire onto Hill 815. We have a recollection from one VPA defender, which was contributed to us by one of our outstanding long marchers on this channel, Hui, who you may know from the comment section as Lustanda. This defender said that as he was there on Hill 815 that morning as part of the VPA's 677th Regiment's 10th Company, that they were suffering badly under very heavy artillery fire that was unusually well coordinated. He said the whole company fought tenaciously, broke dozens of enemy attacks to the last man. But when the rest of the PLA's 5th Company joined the attack, they got so much machine gun and mortar support that they could isolate the Vietnamese defenders up there on 815 and thwart efforts to reinforce them. And so by 8:30 in the morning, just an hour and a half into the battle, they owned Hill 815. When I was young, there was a US Army recruiting commercial that said, "We do more before 9 a.m. than most people do all day." Well, I guess 5th Company had that mug. Now, the next piece of the battle belonged to 6th Company. They were supposed to seize a spot across the road from Hill 815. It was called Hill 14. It wasn't very big, but its superpower was that if the Vietnamese main body tried to escape from the battlefield, they were going to have to pass underneath it. And if they did that, the PLA wanted to be on top of that little hillock so that the Vietnamese would have to retreat right past their guns. The problem was that to get to this little Hill 14, 6th Company had to maneuver through possibly the steepest, worst terrain and the most confusing area of the battlefield, and they could not crack that nut. The topography around there was so weird that 6th Company actually got lost on their approach march, and they just arrived late for the attack. And then, on top of that, within minutes, they lost one of their squad leaders. And they were getting pasted with Vietnamese heavy weapons. They actually charged the hill 4 times, but each time they got driven to ground. Now, after that, from across the road, their buddies in 5th Company were firing their own heavy weapons. And if I understand right, that fire was directed at the enemy on Hill 14 to try to help their buddies who were trying to assault the hill. However, it was also preventing them from making that assault. They didn't want to just walk into their friendly machine gun supporting fire. And finally, the assault company now had over 50% casualties. And things settled into a stalemate way over on the other side of the battle, 2 kilometers away on the Chinese right flank. 3rd Battalion was supposed to be supporting these difficult main attacks by grabbing hilltops over there from the Vietnamese, where they could then unlimber heavy weapons and start delivering flanking fire onto a bunch of those tough nuts in the Vietnamese center. And now came one of the greatest feats of heroism of that whole war. A platoon from 7th Company was held up by an unusually large bunker that actually held 2 Vietnamese light machine guns and an AK, each firing from a different port. A young man named Tang Di-zhong, whose name means upstanding loyalty, he was a kid who'd been in the army for less than 2 months. He grabbed a satchel charge from his squad leader, and he went creeping along toward this bunker, getting as close as he could invisibly, using the PLA's famous talent for putting themselves into little tiny folds of the microterrain that would cover them. It wasn't exactly perfect protection, but as Tang went, he was scavenging grenades from dead PLA bodies. So he would scooch up to a dead body, get a grenade off it, fling it, and then use that as cover to wriggle along to the next body. And that actually got him up to one of this big bad bunker's firing points. And once he got there, he took his satchel charge and bloop, put it in there. And that produced what? Not a thunderclap, not a geyser of dirt and Vietnamese people. It produced no effect. Tang's satchel charge had fallen victim to the dampness of that Vietnamese jungle, and it had turned into a dud. Tang did have one other thing looped around his arm that he had picked up off a dead body. It was some det cord. Now, it was also wet with other people's blood, but he wondered, would this maybe set off that dud satchel charge? So he took this det cord and he stuffed that into the bunker's firing slit. Bloop! And again, nothing. Strike 2. History does not record what the Vietnamese soldiers inside this bunker were thinking at this point. Did they notice that their bunker was slowly filling up with soggy foreign objects. Me, anytime I'm teaching a class and a wet satchel charge flies in, I don't just assume that it's harmless. I pause my lecture, I assign a couple of upperclassmen to throw grenades out the door, and then we continue the discussion. So if I were Tang Lijong, I would be very nervous that the Vietnamese defenders were going to start tossing grenades my way. Luckily, Tang found that he was not alone now. A comrade of his had followed along behind him, bearing another satchel charge. He handed this one forward to Tang. Tang yanked the pull handle, and the pull handle came off in his hand. It didn't even engage the wire that was supposed to start the fuse. The little handle just snapped in two and fell off. Now, I can't help thinking that if Tang's demolition squad had just traded their dud explosives with the jabronis over in their sister division, who had been blowing themselves up all week, maybe everyone would have had a much safer campaign. But alas, well, Tang was a quick thinking guy. When this pull handle fell off the most recent satchel charge, from somewhere deep in Tong's reptile brain, he just decided that he was going to take this dangly little wire and bite it and pull it that way. That started the countdown on the fuse, and now he just stood up before God and everyone in the middle of this battlefield and bloop, pitched in his third piece of defective ordnance. What would this one do? Well, it finally did its job. It blew a chunk from the roof of this massive Vietnamese bunker, and the bunker went quiet. Everyone was happy now, right? Well, let's see. Second platoon stood up now and resumed its charge up the hill, and damn it, this evil Hydra-headed Vietnamese bunker grew more machine guns and started shooting again. Young Tong may have been 1-3 against this bunker now, but whatever Vietnamese soldiers in there did or did not die from his previous attack, they apparently had a really deep bench of Vietnamese guys in this thing. So now, again, poor young Tang Lijong repeated his attack. If anyone is listening in the PRC, for heaven's sake, write to your 人大代表 and ask for this soldier to be awarded more medals, like one for every defective ammunition that he'd already thrown in there, and ask for the Order of August 1st for what he did next. Because this poor son of a gun was not done yet. He was named Upstanding Loyalty Tang Lijong, for some pretty good reasons. Because now he found another satchel charge and a grenade, and he got moving. You got to figure that by this point, Tang must have known the layout of this damned bunker pretty well. He had spent enough time on the property. So by now, he knew where the exit was from this bunker. And the first thing he did was walk up and pitch his grenade at this door, just to keep the heads down from any bad guys that might be thinking about popping out and counterattacking him. His next move was really incredible. He pranced like a little graceful Bambi up onto the roof of the bunker next to the missing chunk that he had just blown out of its roof. He did not want to drop his most recent satchel charge straight down and just blow up the same section of empty bunker all over again. This thing was broad and deep, and his problem was that the bunker had this other half over there, and that part was still alive and fighting. So as hard as he could, he leaned down and heaved his satchel charge sideways through the hole in the roof as far as he could into its other half. And then almost in the same motion, he flitted off the roof in the opposite direction, and he hid. And this time, they say, the bunker damn near turned upside down. The thing just blew right up. Out of the firing slits came gore and bloody chunks. And inside, they later found the remains of an entire VPA squad that probably had just set some kind of provincial record in Vietnam for pounds of hand-carried explosive that got dropped right next to them. The 3rd Battalion also had one other assignment, aside from securing the regiment's right flank. That was to support the main attack on those formidable Vietnamese positions on and around the center of the battlefield. One key spot was called Hill 11, and it happened to be very favorably located because from Hill 11, you could cut off or fire on almost any other Vietnamese position in that network of hills. So 8th Company got the job of hitting that place. Their problem was that they were going to have to run through 400 meters of nice, flat rice paddy to get there. Now, rice paddies are not good for running through in the first place because they're devoid of cover, it's slow, mucky going. And then on top of that, 8th Company was going to have to jump a 4-meter river gulch. So this would make a military obstacle course look ridiculously optimistic. So because of the difficulty of this naked, wide open charge, 8th Company got lots of preparatory artillery bombardment. It was one of those classic rolling barrages. The artillery fired, and then it lifted their fire and moved it farther back toward the enemy, and 8th Company could then run up behind the artillery fire. After that, they had to climb a 12-foot sheer rock face and get on top of it. Again, this is like something out of American Ninja. The first guys reached the rock face, and then they formed those human ladders, and the next guys ran up and alley-ooped up the escarpment, and then they kept attacking. This was bananas. 8th Company was now inside the Vietnamese trench system, trying to slug their way from the outside of the trench network toward the inside. And they were doing this uphill. In the meantime, the Vietnamese garrison in the village below them had also jumped into the trench network. And they were trying to slither up the trenches behind 8th Company and attack them from the back, too. So there's 8th Company punching down against the Vietnamese defenders trying to creep up behind them. Also punching up against the Vietnamese defenders on the hilltop. And amazingly, they made it. I don't know how this is possible, but they got up there and seized it in, get this, 23 minutes. So friends, let's pan out now. Overall, the battle was now going great for the PLA, just not at the one spot where it mattered the most. The Vietnamese right wing's center of mass, Old Hill 13. That was the spot where poor 6th Company had gotten bogged down in the worst terrain of the whole area of operations. In fact, all of 2nd Battalion was really hurting now. They had over 50% casualties, and the Vietnamese positions opposite them were getting reinforced. So it was now that the regiment sent in its reserve and ace card, 2nd Company. The 2nd Company of the 368th were the biggest swinging you-know-whats in the whole Guangzhou military district. They were the cream of 9 divisions. I mentioned recently in an episode about the PLA's logistical woes and their pre-invasion workups that most of the regular companies were getting robbed of a lot of their veteran soldiers and diluted with novice recruits who were so green that they glowed. However, 2nd Company was kind of special. They were the pride of the military district, and they got protected somewhat. I mean, don't get me wrong. They too were denuded of men, just not as much as other companies in the regiment. 2nd Company got to keep more men than any company in the whole division, actually, well over half of their long service soldiers. That was a mark of their distinction. And it's because they were the golden goose. They were the most competent and dangerous 100 riflemen that the PLA had to offer in the military district. So they were kept intact as much as possible, so that in case the hour ever came that 100,000 screaming Maoists could not get the job done, and they needed 100 picked men to smash through the vile dog's head of revisionism, they could call on the 2nd Company. And friends, that hour was now. At noon, 5 hours into the invasion of Vietnam. Second Company now did something that's a PLA specialty that I think would be frowned upon today in most Western armies. The company officers took control of individual platoons. As we're going to see in a future episode about political officers, this happened all the time. It was very common in PLA practice for an officer to come down from one or even two levels above to take control of a small unit that he was really much too senior to command and take it over. That wasn't considered micromanaging. That was considered reinforcing the leadership. Of course, that had pros and cons, and we'll talk about those in a future episode. Well, now the company XO came down and took personal command of one platoon. The company political officer did the same with another platoon, and together they were going to try a double envelopment. However, they came under murderous fire from one of these Vietnamese high points, and the leader of 1st Platoon was shot and killed. But then that's part of the reason why the company officers had come to reinforce and lead these attacks personally. Leaders were definitely going to get killed. That was guaranteed by the PLA's lead from the front command style. And when that happened, this was how they ensured that the attack wouldn't falter, because someone would be left to lead. And since this was an extra important attack, it had better be an extra important leader. So with this attack force getting murdered by Vietnamese guns on top of Hill 202, the XO organized every light machine gun he had in their two platoons, 6 squads total, 6 RPD light machine guns, and he set all of them to suppressing those damn guns on Hill 202. Well, that wasn't the only heavy weapon support they had. They also could call on every heavy weapon that 2nd Company owned, plus some more from a different company, all plastering the objective that they were trying to reach. In total, they had 13 machine guns combing the enemy's trenches on Hill 202. They also had 3 recoilless rifles that were ferreting out firing ports on hidden bunkers, and they had all the company's mortars suppressing the neighboring Hill 13 so that it couldn't lend support to the Vietnamese defenders through flanking fire. So with that, the remainder of these 2 badly mauled platoons continued their dash for the hilltop. Along the way, somebody got into the trenches at the foot of Hill 202 with an RPG, and he too started laying waste to Vietnamese machine gun nests. It took them hours to do this, but by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the PLA had taken Hill 12 and it had erased all signs of life from Hill 202. And now some staff officer in the Guangzhou military district could feel really good about himself that he had kept 2nd Company together instead of letting them be chopped up and parted out like other rifle companies. As the sun lowered itself toward the mountaintops that day, the regiment was solidifying the day's conquests, which was total. And as junior officers would have been setting watch rotations for the next night and squaring away their perimeters because they knew that they were going to be counterattacked during the night. That was just a Vietnamese given. As they were doing this, they got an extremely troubling message from their extremely troubled company commanders. They were being ordered to quit the hilltops that they just captured and return to their lines of departure from that morning? What in the name of Marx, Lenin, and Engels was going on? Their company commanders didn't have answers to give them, but I think their faces said what they were thinking. There's only one reason to give up a splendid advance and then turn around and go back where you came from. And that's if something is going very, very wrong elsewhere on the wider strategic battlefield, and somewhere the front has caved in, possibly, say, a few miles away. Your sister division, the 122nd, maybe they've proven as helpless at infantry combat as they are at demolitions. You wouldn't have to be a huge cynic to think that maybe those bozos in the 122nd got their hands on a battlefield nuke and managed to blow themselves up with that too. Or maybe they just collapsed and they allowed a huge Vietnamese counterattack into China itself. Maybe a couple miles over the horizon, there were now a pair of Vietnamese divisions enveloping the PLA 368th Regiment right now. That's the only reason the division would be calling right now. In the hour of victory, as the propaganda photographers were actually staging a huge huzzah photograph of the conquest. That's the only reason that they would now order the regiment, retreat at once. Do not wait to blow up the enemy fortifications and weapons. Do not collect your dead. Just go back at once. Go all the way back. So they did right away. Yes, it was surprising and alarming, but Division knew what they were doing, right? Right? Well, no, friends. This was yet another case in this war of staff officers playing stupid telephone games. You might see our earlier mini-series about the Battle of Bridge 4. Here's what happened. Remember just a few hours before, at about 3 in the afternoon, when 2nd Battalion, the main attack, was bogged down with the final objectives, the crown jewels, in sight, almost in their grasp, but they were too shot up to get there, and the regiment committed its picked reserve, 2nd Company? Well, at that moment, regiment picked up the field telephone and they called 41 Corps directly. Remember this. They skipped their next higher headquarters, division, and they called straight up to 41 Corps. And they reported the following. They said, 2nd Battalion has taken heavy casualties, but we are determined to seize the final objective and we are committing our reserve. Well, Corps didn't reply to the regiment, who was pretty busy anyway, and they had better stuff to do than hang around and talk on the phone right now. But half an hour later, Corps did phone down to Division, who hadn't been part of this earlier conversation. And they told Division, hey, that 2nd Battalion of yours is taking a beating down there. If they haven't secured Hill 13, the enemy center, by nightfall, we can't leave them hanging out there in Indian country in the dark because they'll get counterattacked during the night and torn apart. So they said, if your 2nd Battalion doesn't get that hill before dark, withdraw them to somewhere safe and organize your lines for the night. It's very sensible, right? If you try to summit Everest and you don't get there in time, well, you need to descend to a safe altitude and bivouac there. Don't just unroll your sleeping bag in the death zone and go to bed. Well, so far so good. Half an hour later, at 4 p.m., Division called back up to Corps and said, hey, if we yank them out of there just short of their objective, that's going to be terrible for their morale. Well, that's a good point, too. So Corps asked Division, okay, what's their situation right now? Are they making progress? Can they secure those hills by nightfall? Good question. A very important question. But this is where the divisional officer on the phone fluffed it. He completely misreported the situation. Probably whoever was on that phone didn't actually look at any reports and he didn't ask anyone because he gave a sit rep that was tragically outdated and partial. The info that he reported was 4 hours old by that point. Namely, 2nd Battalion is getting hammered. Well, that was true at noon, but it was so partial as to be positively misleading because whoever was making that report at Division apparently did not know that the regiment had long since committed its reserve. Because remember, regiment had reported that fact directly to the Corps, not to the division. The division might not have even known that this second attack had gone through by the reserves. Apparently, they never got that memo. Furthermore, way up at Corps HQ, whoever was on the phone there had forgotten or maybe never knew that the regiment had thrown in its reserves, because that guy didn't now think to ask, hey, how's that most recent attack by their fresh, well-rested veteran 2nd Company going? That's too bad that that question never got asked, because it was a good question. And it turned out 2nd Company was well on their way to victory at this point and confident of snatching those hilltops soon. And yet, since their chain of command did not know this, the top dogs at Corps headquarters now made a fateful phone call. At 4:15, they called to division and said, pull your line back. So 15 minutes after that, regiment got this weird, dumb order to pull their troops back. And they actually said to division, look, we're kind of busy right now. We can't pull the troops back just this second because they're busy victoriously charging up their final objective. We'll call you back. And sure enough, less than an hour later, they had secured that final key hilltop. Hooray! And finally, when they called back to division and they said, see, we told you, we have the hilltops, so please don't pull us out now. Now division made its second fatefully dumb decision of the day. Whoever was on that phone did not update Corps HQ on the momentous news, namely, mission accomplished! Nor did he ask himself, hey, what was the Corps commander's intent when he ordered us to pull back the regiment? He only meant us to do that if they failed to take the hills. But now that they have taken the hills, the order is moot. Instead, this anonymous divisional butthead told the regiment, you have your order, now follow it. However, there was a problem. The regiment had never practiced withdrawing. Remember, most of their soldiers had barely finished basic training, and it was a miracle that they attacked as well as they did. But withdrawing in good order during a battle, that's a different skill set. They'd never practiced it. Furthermore, the regiment didn't have any staff plans ready about what to do in the event that they were ordered to withdraw. So nobody could tell 2nd Battalion, say, withdraw in this order along this route to this rally point. Nothing like that. Now the confusion got even worse. The battalion political officer got on the radio and he told each company to, quote, withdraw to your original place. Well, what the hell did original place mean? Was it your jumping off point from the morning attack? Was it your assembly area back in China? Is it your hometown in Jiangxi? No one knew. But what the troops did know was the field grade officers were visibly spooked and disorderly. And so the subordinates concluded from this that somehow the battle had turned pear-shaped for the PLA. Maybe not in the small slice of battlefront that they could see, but somewhere else on the PLA's huge 2-corps front. And they figured that they were now in the midst of some invisible emergency that they just couldn't see. And so, although on the one hand, the company commanders improvised pretty skillfully, as far as I can tell, they chose a retreat route and an order of withdrawal, and they did this large-scale kind of center peel where the frontmost company would withdraw and the next company would cover them. Then they would withdraw under the covering fire of the company behind them, and so on. Great. But even so, two things happened. First was that these companies had no clarity about where they were withdrawing to, other than just that battalion political officer's nebulous order to go back to your original place. And so they did just that. They withdrew back to China, where they'd begun their day. I mean, how else were they supposed to interpret that order? Second, they ended up leaving people behind. A whole platoon on big, bad Hill 815 itself. It turns out word never reached 1st Platoon with the order to withdraw. And so that platoon ended up stuck out there for 3 days and 3 nights in the Badlands, getting enveloped as the VPA reoccupied everything around them. Very, very bad. But I'm sure that at least they were well stocked with water and food, right? Right, PLA logistics? Nope, it was really grim. And by the way, this is when the PLA produced its other most famous hero of that battle, Chen Quangang. We mentioned him in our earlier episode. He was the poor runner who was ordered to go find the lost platoon and bring them back. But instead, he got cut off too among the Vietnamese troops who were seeping back to reclaim Hill 815. And so Chen and his SKS spent the next couple days crawling around, hiding, surviving on dew that he licked from leaves, and sniping at the Vietnamese. And then at last, finding the lost platoon and bringing them home after 3 days. Like many heroes of that war, Chen was celebrated in the papers for his exploits for a couple of days, and then he was killed in battle. It was a very rare person in the 2nd Battalion to have survived even that first day's fighting, much less a full week. Even though Chen did eventually get that one lost platoon back to friendly lines, there was so much else that got left behind that day in the chaos of that meaningless retreat. One was bodies. There were a lot of dead Chinese soldiers up in those hills whose remains were left behind and couldn't be recovered until the PLA went about 10 days later and reconquered that awful area. You might remember that in our earlier story about Wang Zhijun, the machine gun officer, that he was haunted that they had had to leave behind a couple of men that day. One man's remains were recovered, but they'd been exposed in the sun for so many days that there was nothing to do except just cremate them in place. The other man that they left behind turned out to be still alive. He was like Beck Weathers in the famous Everest disaster, and he came back to life and he self-rescued off Hill 815. But he was just severely crippled for the rest of his days. One other important thing got left behind by the regiment on those hilltops was all of the VPA's weapons and ammo that they'd captured and their fortifications. They didn't blow up any of that stuff. It was all left for the VPA to come and reclaim when they came back to their positions that night. The very positions that the PLA had fought for and then vacated senselessly. And so the VPA came and reinvested those same old trenches and earthworks and got right back behind their same old machine guns and pointed them north to China again. 10 days later, the PLA was going to have to go right back and fight them all over again. They were going to meet the very same Vietnamese defenders as before. And in fact, the very man that we heard from earlier, from the Vietnamese 10th Company's original troops. He wrote of that second, even more grim battle, that the outpost at one particular location was completely sacrificed, and there was one lone infantry soldier who aimed at 12.7, basically a Dushka, aimed it straight at the oncoming PLA formation and scattered them alone, made them panic and flee, and he actually held that position all by himself until he was reinforced. A lucky guy to survive that. And there would be a lot of unlucky people on both sides who were going to get ground up when the 368th went back to the hill that they had given up because nobody bothered to give an accurate report. Friends, I'd like to thank our long marcher, Hui, also known in the comments as Lustanda, who helped with today's story. Thank you so much. And if you like this sort of content, please like and subscribe. You might even visit our Patreon page. It helps me to make more content more often. But either way, this course remains free for all the world's workers, soldiers, and peasants. I'm Jason Clower. I can't wait to talk to you next time.